So I'm going to be talking about the vexed question of oil and gas exploration in the Arctic. It would have made more sense for me to be following a talk which was addressing this question of oil and gas exploration, but it's such a present topic to everybody here, and we actually had a sort of little preview of the discussion this morning in the first panel. So I'm here, though, as a climate scientist, and I was involved in the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, reports on 1.5 degrees that was submitted but not welcomed a few months ago. And sorry, I'm referring to what happened in the UN negotiations where they decided to note the report but not to welcome it. People asked me about this, and they said, well, are you sad they're not welcoming your report? And I was like, well, I mean, our report sucks. I mean, it was terrible, so why would you welcome it? I mean, it was a lot of very bad news. But one of the clear points that we were addressing in this report was what would it take? Is it still possible to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, and what would it take to do so? And it was very clear that in order to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, we would have to reduce emissions to zero within 20 to 40 years. Now, what that means is, and that it was possible to find scenarios in which that happened. What that means is that if you try and reduce emissions faster than that, faster than 1 to 2 billion tons of CO2 per year, the models actually crash. So while I can't tell you whether it's possible to reduce emissions that fast, I can tell you with some confidence that it's not possible to reduce emissions faster than that. And that's really important to the debate about oil and gas resources in the Arctic, because if it's going to take us 20 to 40 years minimum to get global emissions to zero, then we are committed, then that commits us to some future emissions, that wedge of emissions in the future, which we're committed to, will take us to 1.5 degrees. So if we're serious about limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, which both Equinor and the Norwegian government have said they are, and we're not reducing emissions, so then the remaining emissions we're committed to, without scrubbing CO2 back out of the atmosphere, are enough to take us there. So what that means is, for every year that we're not reducing emissions by 1 to 2 billion tons of CO2 per year, we're sort of moving along like this at the moment, with emissions actually slightly rising. Every year we're not reducing emissions, that's another 40 billion tons of CO2 that we are committing the next generation or the next generation but one to scrub back out of the atmosphere if we're going to meet our long-term climate goals. Existing oil and gas resources, never mind coal, is enough to fill up that wedge. So we have enough resources already to take us well past 1.5 degrees. So in the debate about should we be opening up the Arctic to new oil and gas exploration, the crucial elephant in the corner is what's going to happen to the CO2 that is generated from those, from the new fossil carbon that is found by opening up these new resources. Environmentalists love to worry about the risk of a tipping points in the climate system, but I would say that the risk of us still having a global fossil fuel industry at the time we reach 1.5 degrees is much higher than the risk of the Greenland ice sheet melting catastrophically in this century. Okay? They're very different kinds of risk. But what it means is we need to be developing policies now to make that global fossil fuel industry consistent with a net zero world. Norway and Equinor are in a unique global position to take a lead on this by developing, to the scale it needs to be developed, the capacity to dispose of the CO2 generated by burning fossil fuels. It's not good enough to say, oh, we're carbon neutral ourselves, we just sell the stuff, when you are in a capacity to neutralize its climate impact. I should say Norway could lead on this, so could the UK, and the UK is doing even less than Norway, so I should stress that to make it clear that it's fair. So we need a fossil fuel industry that's compatible with net zero. Equinor and Norway are uniquely positioned to lead on this, and indeed we heard several times this morning that Norway is a world leader on this. But as far as getting rid of CO2 is concerned, disposing of CO2 underground, sequestering it, called carbon capture and sequestration in the jargon, but there's actually many ways of doing it, Norway is a world leader in a race of tortoises. And sadly, the tortoises have all sort of huddled into their shells and they're not actually going anywhere. So it's all very well being a world leader if we're not actually getting to where we need to go. So this is what needs to change in the debate about opening up new fossil fuel resources. We need to connect the licensing of new fossil fuel reserves with the discussion of what is going to happen to the CO2 they generate. These fields will be producing in decades to come when the world will need to be at net zero emissions if we're going to meet our climate goals. Those who are advocating opening these fields up have to answer the question of what is going to happen to that CO2. And it's not good enough to say, we're just going to sell it and it's going to be somebody else's problem, when you are uniquely positioned to address the solution. Thank you.